to Westminster Presbyterian and our inclusive family of faith. We especially welcome those who are visiting and those who are joining us on YouTube.
Today's gospel reading comes from Luke chapter 9, verses 28 through 36. Now about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then came from the cloud a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
So I'd like for you to close your eyes. We're going to get into an imagining mode here. So close your eyes if you need to. You don't have to. Think about one of the most beautiful things you've ever seen in your whole entire life. Maybe it's the Grand Canyon. Maybe it's your own backyard. Maybe it's your children's faces. Just think of something so incredibly beautiful. And now try to turn that up to 11. Okay? How much more beautiful could it get? The Transfiguration was more dazzling than any of the disciples ever could have guessed they would ever see. It was more dazzling than the sun, more powerful than an earthquake. It was breathtaking, beyond their usual senses. I imagine they might have even felt a little bit of the wind knocked out of them to see up close the glory of God. Have you ever seen something so beautiful and so awesome that it's on the verge of being awful? Because you wind up just feeling like a vulnerable little mess after. Now, I'm going to talk about something that definitely doesn't approach anything near the Transfiguration, but it was so beautiful that I just felt like I had to turn away. It was on the Oscars last Sunday. Did any of you watch? Lady Gaga and Bradley Cooper. Their performance was electric, and it was just one of those things that it was so beautiful, and it was a performance, and they poured so much of themselves into it. It was almost like you had to turn away. I wonder if sometimes we resist coming close to God. We have instead an urge to turn away because we don't like that feeling of vulnerability. We like to feel powerful. We like to feel like we are in control. Who really likes to open their hearts up to feeling vulnerable and weak, laying it all bare? It's uncomfortable. Some of you have probably heard of Brené Brown. She is a social scientist, social work professor at University of Houston, very well known. She has one of the most viewed TED Talks ever, and she writes books about perfection and vulnerability and belonging and shame. She has done some groundbreaking work in that area regarding worthiness and belonging. She, in her TED Talk, explained about her research and her findings. This was before she was really well known, but well known enough to have a TED Talk. And so she's talking about the necessity of vulnerability. And she shares her own story. She was doing her research, figuring out about how necessary vulnerability is, and she identified in herself this urge to control and to predict. But in the course of her research, she found out that the way to live a wholehearted life is to be vulnerable. to stop all of that controlling and predicting. And she did not like that at all. She started to kind of bump up against her own research, and she says that she had a breakdown of sorts. On the TED Talk screen behind her, it says breakdown with it crossed out, and then it says spiritual awakening underneath it. It's a better way to phrase it. So she decided for a little while that she was going to put her data away and go into therapy. And so she told her therapist, and this is all stuff she shares in her TED Talk. She says, I have a vulnerability issue. I need some help. But here's the thing. No family stuff. No childhood stuff. I just need some strategies. I want to say to that, ha! She didn't want to delve into her own background. She just wanted strategies to deal with vulnerability. So again, she's not actually trying to deal with her vulnerability. And she recognized that, and that's why she shared that ironic story. And in one of her later books, she shared that after she gave her TED Talk, she had what she calls a vulnerability hangover. When you wake up the next day feeling fine until you remember what you did to lay yourself bare, the memory of yourself opening up washes over you, and you want to just hide under the covers for the next day or two or maybe a week. She thought to herself, what did I do? 500 people officially think I'm crazy and it totally sucks. I forgot to mention 2 important things. I must leave town. Opening up to the world, opening up to other people, opening up to God, that is a risky move. We often don't take that risk because we know what it could cost. It's not always well received by others when we are fully ourselves and fully open. Remember the story about Moses on Mount Sinai that you just heard Jim read a few minutes ago? Came down with the covenant tablets in his hands. He didn't realize his face was shining brightly with the glory of God. And how did Aaron and the other Israelites react? They were scared. They were scared to come close to him. And so he had to put a veil over his face. We keep our faces veiled too. We might not think of it that way, but after we've had an epiphany or maybe a mountaintop experience with God, we might let our faces shine a little bit, but then we figure it's too much for everyone else, and so we stop sharing, we stop talking, we stop shining. We close it up, we lock it in, because we don't want to make other people feel uncomfortable talking about this amazing love that we have experienced from God. But even when we close it up, the glory of God still shines through. There's nothing we can do about that, really. On this Transfiguration Sunday, every year we remember this clear epiphany. This was the most overt revelation of Christ's glory during his lifetime. And can you blame the disciples for wanting to stay on the mountain? For wanting to build those dwellings and to just stay? Because everyone else there who was there on that mountain, they experienced it firsthand. They knew themselves the wonder and the beauty. They got it. And so isn't it so much more comfortable to be vulnerable and open with others who understand? You don't have to explain it. You don't have to try to hide anything. So let's just stay on the mountaintop, right? Why don't we all just move into this sanctuary? This is a beautiful place with beautiful people. We could just live here all the time. What a great life. Wanting to stay right where we are, where we don't have to share that shining face. Is that our way of distancing ourselves from the uncomfortableness of vulnerability? Maybe even when we're on the mountaintop, we start doing that. We try to start making meaning of the experience, distracting ourselves as we get busy with building an altar. We get busy with talking and doing and running from place to place, instead of just being in the moment, instead of just breathing it in, instead of just listening to Jesus, as the voice from heaven told them to do. Even when we get together with other people from church who get it, who have experienced the wonder and the glory of God, presumably a lot of people who have had those mountaintop experiences, there is still so often a wall up. We say, "How are you?" to each other. And how do we respond? Fine. As we go on to get the fellowship dinner ready or to do the next outreach project or something else that's really good work, but maybe not what we should be doing at that moment. Because sometimes that busy work, even though it's good work, feels better than bearing our souls. Too exposing to cry or to celebrate or to pray honestly with each other. But then we remember Paul's words to the Corinthians. Since then we have such a hope, we act with great boldness. The Israelites couldn't bear the glory on Moses' face. Their minds were hardened against it. We can't blame them. We do that too. When things get too hard or too beautiful, we shut down, close off, get stiff. We find ourselves in a bubble of pleasantry, dealing with the hard stuff or the knock the wind out of you awesomeness only when we really have to. One of those really have to days is quickly approaching, Ash Wednesday. That is another day of vulnerability, dealing with hard stuff, admitting our sin, coming clean about our real dependence on God, coming face to face with our own mortality. But God gives us hope and calls us to act with great boldness, to love God and neighbors boldly. There were a lot of examples of that this week in the course of and then in the wake of the United Methodist Church's special general conference. You've probably read about it in the news. Unfortunately, the conference delegates voted by a slim margin for what they called the traditional plan, excluding LGBTQIA clergy and coming down with more harsh penalties against bishops and pastors who perform same-sex marriages and name bishops who are LGBTQ. There was a lot of pain and hurt through the course of the conference, but also bold showings of love. I work at Bright Divinity School at TCU in the admissions department, and for the whole course of the conference, there was a vigil led by our Methodist professor. She was there as a pastoral presence and guide to our students and faculty and staff who are Methodist and feeling deeply the pain and the questioning about what comes next. Churches across the United States, Methodist and not, reaffirmed their welcome of all people. And the Western jurisdiction of the United Methodist Church, their bishops, current and retired bishops, came out with a statement followed by a video and website where they reaffirm the inclusion of all God's children in the body of Christ. In the video and in the statement, they said things like, "We are committed to be a courageous church in mission and ministry, including with our ethnic and marginalized communities. We prioritize this work because Jesus prioritized this work in his life and ministry." They said things like, "We understand diversity in its many forms, not as something to be merely tolerated, but as Christ's gift that enriches our discipleship, that enhances our common life as disciples of Jesus Christ." And they said things like this: "We will continue to be a home for all God's people, gathered around a table of reconciliation and transformation." That is a good word in a world that is hurting and needs to hear the good news of transformation, of transfiguration. That happens not just in a moment, but day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute, bit by bit. Paul writes that in Christ the veil is set aside. All of us with unveiled faces, seeing the glory of God, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. Therefore, do not lose heart. When we stop hiding ourselves, our failings, our hopes, our fears, we truly open ourselves to being changed by the Spirit of God. And so as we're about to enter this Lenten journey, we can think about how might we look for God in that moment to moment, in the day by day. How can we taste God's glory and not be ashamed to share it? How might we notice God in all places, not just on the mountaintops? Catherine Matthews Huey is a United Church of Christ pastor, and I loved what she had to say about this passage. She writes, "God is in the beauty of nature in all its glory. God is in those moments of unconditional, tender love we share. God is there, between the lines. When we share our stories and our fragile hopes, God is there in our suffering and in every moment of rescue, restoration, and resurrection. God is there. God is here. God is with each one of us along the way. No matter how good or how bad it gets, God is with us. May we recognize it. May the light shine into our eyes and onto our faces, so that the world gets to know the glory and the love of God just a little bit more, because we're in it, walking in the way of Christ. Transform